Ice-laced wind shrieks across Detroit. On a 5 a.m. construction site, a German Shepherd canine named Rook watches from the shadows as an 8-year-old boy, Liam, stacks frozen bricks. He is forced to work, a replacement for his cruel stepmother's lazy lover. The mud is frozen. The hard hat is too big. Her white puffer jacket gleams like a warning. Behind her impatience is a simple, selfish plan. Use the boy, protect the man, and cash the checks. But high above, a single loose brick is about to fall. One desperate 911 call has already been made. And when Rook moves, the site will shift from a prison to evidence, from terror to rescue. What happens next will make you believe in guardian angels who wear K9 vests and the second chances God provides. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. The 5 o'clock darkness over Detroit was absolute, a heavy, chemical-laced velvet that swallowed the stars. This was not the gentle dark of the suburbs, but an industrial abyss, sliced open only by the brutal, sodium-yellow glare of floodlights. They illuminated the skeleton of a future skyscraper, its steel beams reaching into the freezing air like the bones of a half-eaten beast. The wind, a merciless entity sweeping off the frozen expanse of Lake St. Clair, carried the metallic taste of the rail yards and the faint, bitter smell of snow that refused to fall. It was 17 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air itself felt sharp enough to cut skin, a physical assault on any exposed flesh. This was the hostile heart of the city, long before the city itself had woken up, and it was no place for a child. And in this landscape of industrial giants, a small figure moved with the frantic, bird-like motions of survival. This was Liam. He was 8 years old, though starvation and cold had carved him into something smaller, sharper, making him look closer to 6. He was utterly lost inside a man's tattered canvas work coat. The sleeves rolled up so many times they formed thick, stiff donuts around his bony wrists. On his hands were a pair of stiff, adult-sized work gloves, soaked through with melted frost and mud, the fingers flopping uselessly an inch past his own. His task was simple and impossible, moving a pallet of concrete bricks from a muddy, ice-slicked patch of ground to a cleaner, wooden platform 20 yards away. Each brick was a block of pure, stinging ice, the frost biting at his palms even through the wet wool. He worked with a desperate, sealant focus, his small face, all sharp cheekbones and large, haunted gray eyes, pinched against the cold. His breath plumed in front of him, a tiny, fading cloud of proof that he was still alive. He was not alone. Leaning against the polished wheel well of a pristine black SUV, a vehicle insultingly clean amidst the surrounding filth, a woman watched him. Brenda. She was, by all conventional measures, a striking woman in her mid-30s, though life was beginning to etch hard lines around her mouth. She had sharp, fox-like features and hair the color of bottled peroxide, pulled back from her high forehead into a tight, severe ponytail that seemed to pull her eyes taut. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh lights, powdered heavily to cover the flaws. She wore an expensive hip-length white puffer jacket, a stark splash of purity against the mud, paired with tight black jeans tucked into impractical heeled leather boots. A plume of vapor escaped her thin, red-painted lips as she exhaled from a cigarette, the cherry-red tip glowing like a tiny, malevolent eye in the dark. This was Liam's stepmother, a title she had acquired 2 years ago after his father, Robert, married her, and a role she had fully inherited when Robert tragically fell from a steel beam 6 months later. Brenda wasn't watching Liam with the concern of a mother. She was watching him with the impatient scrutiny of a foreman, checking a faulty and deeply annoying piece of machinery. "Move it, Liam!" Brenda's voice cut through the wind, thin and sharp as a shard of glass. "Vince needs that stack cleared before the real crew clocks in. Do you want to make him lose this job? Do you?" Liam flinched, his shoulder hunching instinctively, as if expecting a blow, but he didn't look up. He just fumbled for another brick. The "we" in her statement was a lie. The only one who would truly suffer from Vince's unemployment was Brenda herself. Vince was the entire reason they were here, standing in this frozen hell at 5 a.m. He was Brenda's new man, a relationship that had begun with indecent haste after Liam's father was buried. Vince was a bull of a man, thick-necked and fleshy, with a lazy swagger and small, calculating eyes set too close together. He had a perpetually unshaven jaw that always looked greasy, and a laugh that was too loud and always at someone else's expense. He had managed, through some connection of Brenda's, to get this job as a general laborer, a job he was pathologically inept at, preferring the heated comfort of the site's office trailer, where he was right now, to any actual work. Vince was, predictably, late, again. He'd likely spent last night's paycheck at a bar on Michigan Avenue, and had probably called Brenda an hour ago, whining about being too sick to work the early shift. Brenda, whose entire financial stability now precariously hinged on this oaf's employment, and, more importantly, the Social Security survivor's checks she collected in Liam's name, was in full-blown damage control mode. Her solution was as simple as it was cruel. Drag Liam out of his bed, drive him to the site, and have the 8-year-old perform the most basic of Vince's setup duties before the real site foreman, a notoriously tough man named Gus, arrived at 6 a.m. It was a desperate, twisted calculus. Use the child to protect the man-child. Across the yard, another figure was present, though he stayed deep in the shadows of the main scaffolding rig, near the cement mixer. This was Sal. He was 62, a carpenter with hands so gnarled by arthritis and a lifetime of labor they looked like old tree roots. He had a face like a worn leather map, deeply creased and sun-beaten, with kind, tired eyes and a thick gray mustache stained yellow from decades of roll-up cigarettes. Sal always arrived an hour early, not for overtime, but for the quiet, to drink his thermos of black coffee before the chaos of the day began. He had seen the black SUV pull up. He had seen the small boy get out, stumbling in the dark. He had watched this grotesque pantomime for 3 days now, a hot, acidic ball of shame and fear burning in his stomach. He was afraid of losing this job, the one that paid for his wife's expensive medication. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself the kid was probably just helping out. But he knew, in the pit of his gut, that he was watching something deeply wrong. So he stayed quiet, his silence feeling heavier than any brick Liam lifted. Liam's arms burned. The wet cold had seeped past his skin and into his bones. His fingers had long since gone numb, turning into clumsy, useless appendages. He tried to grip the sharp corner of a brick, but his frozen, glove-covered fingers slid right off the icy surface. It fell to the mud with a wet, heavy thud. Brenda swore, a sharp, ugly sound that made Liam freeze. "Useless," she hissed, striding toward him. Her heels punched angry holes in the frozen ground. She didn't hit him, not here, not in the open. But she grabbed the rolled-up sleeve of his coat, her long, manicured nails digging painfully into his thin arm. "Listen to me, you little rat," she whispered, her voice a low, intense vibration of fury. "You are going to pick up these bricks, and you are going to do it now. Vince is in that trailer, resting up so he can work a double shift. All for us. He is trying to get us a better life, and you can't even stack a few lousy bricks? You owe us this. You owe him this, after everything we do for you." Liam squeezed his eyes shut, nodding frantically, the motion jerky. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry." He knew Vince wasn't resting up. He was asleep, or perhaps drinking the foreman's coffee, warm and safe in the heated trailer just 50 yards away. But he knew the script. He was the problem. He was the burden. Sal, from his hiding spot, saw the exchange and quickly looked away, his face hot with shame. He took a long, bitter sip of his coffee. It tasted like ash. He watched Brenda storm back to her SUV, pulling her phone out, probably to text Vince that his shift was almost covered. Liam was left alone again in the vast, freezing, indifferent yellow light. He looked at the pallet of bricks. It seemed impossibly large, a mountain he could never move. He was a replacement, a stand-in, a small, disposable part in Brenda's desperate, selfish machine, forced to labor in the shadow of the very industry that had claimed his father, all to protect a lazy, worthless man he despised. He took a shaky, agonizing breath, the air stinging his lungs like fire, and reached for the next brick. Liam reached for the next brick. His body, a small, frail engine running on the fumes of fear, was beginning to fail. The cold was no longer just a sensation. It was a weight, a physical presence pressing him down. His movements had become slow, clumsy, almost dreamlike. He managed to lift another brick, but as he turned, his foot, numb inside its oversized boot, slipped on a patch of black ice hidden beneath the mud. He didn't just stumble, he fell, sprawling hard onto the frozen ground. The brick flew from his grasp and shattered into 3 pieces. For a long, terrible second, Liam didn't move. He lay on his side, the sharp, freezing gravel digging into his cheek, the wind howling in his ears. The yellow floodlights swam dizzily above him. He felt a devastating wave of failure, colder than the ice. He hadn't just failed to move the brick, he had broken it. He had cost her money. Brenda, who had been impatiently scrolling through her phone by the SUV, saw the fall. She let out a sound of pure, exasperated fury, a sharp tsk that cut the air. She strode back over, her boots crunching angrily. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her presence was a storm front. She grabbed Liam not by the coat, but by the thin, bony shoulder underneath it, her long nails digging in like talons. "Get up," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that was somehow louder than a scream. She hauled him to his feet. Liam cried out, a small, choked sound. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." "Shut up," Brenda snapped, shoving him back toward the pallet. "You are worthless. You know that? Absolutely worthless. Finish this stack, now." She pointed a finger at the remaining bricks, her hand trembling slightly, not from cold, but from rage. She then turned and marched back to the warmth of her running vehicle, slamming the door hard enough to make the metal echo. From the shadows, Sal watched, and something inside him finally broke. The hot, acidic shame he'd been swallowing for 3 days finally burned its way up his throat. He was 62. He had worked these sites since he was 16. He had seen men fight, seen them get hurt, seen them cheat and steal. But this was different. This was a child, no bigger than his own grandson, Leo. He saw Leo's face in Liam's, and the image shattered his carefully constructed wall of apathy. He thought of his wife, Mary, and her prescriptions, the fear of losing this job, the fear of making trouble. But then he looked at the boy, who was trying to lift another brick with arms that were visibly shaking, his small body racked with shivers. The fear of doing nothing suddenly became greater than the fear of doing something. Sal made his decision. He backed away, deeper into the unfinished concrete skeleton of the building, where the shadows were absolute. He pulled out his own phone, a cheap, outdated flip phone with a cracked screen. His fingers, gnarled and stiff from the cold, fumbled with the small plastic buttons. He dialed 911. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard he was sure Brenda could hear it 50 yards away. The line clicked. 911, what is your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, female, impossibly distant. Sal pressed the phone hard against his ear, cupping his other hand around his mouth, his voice a desperate, gravelly whisper. Yeah, hello. I'm at the construction site, the new tower, on Griswold Street, downtown. Listen, there's a kid here, a little boy, maybe 7, 8 years old. He's working. His mother, or stepmother, I don't know, she's forcing him. Stacking bricks. It's 17 degrees out here. He's gonna die. He paused, listening. I don't know his name. Please, you gotta send someone. He looked frantically toward Brenda's SUV. But you can't use sirens. Please, no sirens. She'll see him. She'll just grab the kid and leave. You gotta come quiet, please. He hung up before the operator could ask another question, shoving the phone deep into his pocket as if it were contraband. He stood there for a full minute, shaking, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline of his transgression. He felt like a traitor, and for the first time in days, he also felt like a man. He slowly walked back to his thermos, his secret hanging in the frozen air between him and the boy. Miles away, in a quiet, working-class neighborhood that hadn't yet woken up, a different kind of vigil was being kept. A black Ford Explorer K9 unit idled at the curb, its engine a low, comforting rumble. Inside, Officer Elias Thorne sat in the driver's seat, nursing a styrofoam cup of lukewarm gas station coffee. Thorne was in his late 30s, a man built with the lean, functional strength of a runner, not a brawler. His face was angular, all hard planes and shadows under the green glow of the dashboard lights, with a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a permanent reminder of a mistake made long ago. His hair was short, military-cut brown, and his eyes were a piercing, observant gray. He was a quiet man, deliberate in his movements and his speech, a trait that made him an exceptional K9 handler and an unnervingly effective officer. This quietness was a shield, forged during a difficult childhood spent navigating the shifting, impersonal landscapes of the Michigan foster care system. He understood, better than most, what it meant to be small and overlooked. In the custom-fitted kennel space behind him, his partner lay silent, but not asleep. K9 Rook was a magnificent 4-year-old German Shepherd, 90 pounds of coiled muscle and disciplined intelligence, his black and tan saddle coat thick and pristine. He was at his physical peak, a perfect specimen of his breed. His dark, almond-shaped eyes were open, fixed on the back of Thorn's head, watching, listening. Rook was more than a dog. He was Thorn's anchor. Trained in patrol, tracking, and detection, his greatest uncertified skill was his preternatural ability to sense the minute shifts in his handler's biochemistry, the subtle tensing of a muscle, the fractional increase in his heart rate. The bond between them was absolute, forged through thousands of hours of training and the shared danger of the streets. Thorn reached a hand back, a practiced, unconscious gesture, and scratched the thick ruff of fur on Rook's neck. Rook leaned into the touch, letting out a low, almost silent woof of contentment. The quiet shattered. The static of the radio condensed into the calm, professional voice of the dispatcher. All units in the 1st Precinct, available car, respond to a 4:15 check welfare at 1200 Griswold, the new tower construction site. Received an anonymous 911 call reporting possible child endangerment. Thorn's hand froze on Rook's neck. Caller states an approximately 8-year-old male is being forced to perform manual labor in hazardous, freezing conditions by a female guardian. Caller requests a silent approach. Thorn's entire demeanor shifted. The casual, end-of-shift fatigue vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. Of all the calls, all the code words, robberies, assaults, domestic disputes, the 2 words child endangerment were the only ones that could still breach his carefully constructed walls. They struck something personal, something deep. Rook, sensing the sudden tension in his handler, instantly rose from his lying position. He was on his feet, alert, his ears pricked forward, his body poised. Thorn grabbed the radio handset. Unit 14 K9, his voice was level, calm, betraying no emotion. Show me en route to 1200 Griswold. Acknowledge silent approach. He dropped the mic, put his coffee cup in the holder, and shifted the SUV into drive. He didn't turn on his lights or his siren. He simply pulled away from the curb, a dark, silent shadow accelerating through the empty, pre-dawn streets of Detroit, heading straight for the sickly yellow glow in the sky. The black K9 Explorer glided to a halt in the deep shadows of a neighboring derelict warehouse, 100 yards from the construction site's main gate. Elias Thorn killed the engine. The sudden absence of the low rumble plunged the cabin into an absolute, preternatural stillness, broken only by the incessant, high-pitched whine of the wind shearing against the steel fence. From this vantage point, the construction site was laid bare, a self-contained island of harsh, artificial yellow light against the gray pre-dawn misery of Detroit. Thorn's sharp, analytical gaze swept the scene, cataloging every detail. The black SUV, engine still idling, exhaust pumping white clouds into the air. The small, solitary figure of Liam, moving with a painful stop-start rhythm near the base of the main scaffolding. And the primary site trailer, lights blazing, chimney puffing smoke. His jaw tightened. The anonymous 911 call was accurate. Watch, Thorn said softly. In the back, K9 Rook was already standing, perfectly balanced, his entire body a rigid sculpture of focused energy. His black ears swiveled like radar dishes, capturing sounds Thorn couldn't hear. The clink of brick on brick, the distant crunch of boots on gravel. A low, guttural whine rumbled deep in the dog's chest, a signal of profound agitation. Rook could smell the boy's fear on the wind, a sharp, coppery scent that cut through the odors of diesel and frozen mud. Thorn checked his watch, 5:47 a.m. The city's main industrial artery was beginning to stir. The first distant rumbles of delivery trucks echoed from the freeway. Inside her warm SUV, Brenda checked her own watch, a delicate, gold-plated thing on her slender wrist. She let out an aggravated sigh. Gus, the real site foreman, would be here any minute, and Vince was still hiding in the trailer like a coward. The bricks weren't stacked, and her idiot lover was nowhere to be seen. This was untenable. With a final furious glance at Liam, who was now pathetically trying to restack the bricks he had dropped, she threw open her door and marched across the muddy yard, her heeled boots sinking unsteadily with every step. She reached the foreman's trailer and pounded on the thin aluminum door, her fist rattling the entire structure. "Vince, get your worthless hide out here, now!" The The door swung open, spilling a wave of oppressive heat, stale coffee, and sweat into the frozen air. And there was Vince. He was a large man, fleshy and soft in a way that suggested a lifetime of avoiding physical labor. He was in his late 30s, with a thick, greasy-looking neck and small, puffy eyes that were barely open. A 2-day growth of dark stubble covered his jowls, and his lank, dark hair was matted to his head from sleep. He wore a dirty thermal shirt, stained with what looked like mustard, and his tool belt, the one he was paid to wear, was sitting on the table behind him, empty. He squinted at Brenda, his face a mask of annoyance. "Jesus. Bren, keep it down. I got a headache. What's the panic?" Brenda shoved past him into the trailer, her voice a low, furious hiss. "The panic, you moron, is that Gus is due in 10 minutes. The bricks aren't done, and the kid looks like he's about to collapse. You need to be seen. You need to look like you're working." Vince rubbed his face, his laziness a tangible force. "I'm sick, I told you. Just tell Gus I was in the latrine." "No," she snapped. "I'm not covering for you again. Get dressed. Go up to the 5th floor platform. Just bang on something. Look like you're securing the rebar. I don't care. Just be visible and look busy." Vince grumbled, casting a longing glance at the half-full pot of coffee. But the fear in Brenda's eyes finally motivated him. He knew she was the only thing keeping him from being fired. Fine. Keep your hair on." He grabbed his tool belt, which jangled uselessly, and picked up a long steel pry bar that was leaning against the wall. He stumbled out of the trailer, pulling on a hard hat, and trudged toward the scaffolding. From his vantage point, Sal, the old carpenter, watched Vince emerge and felt his stomach sink. While Brenda was a snake, Vince was a bull, stupid, clumsy, and dangerous. Sal instinctively took a step back, melting further into the shadows of his cement mixer, his 911 call feeling suddenly, terrifyingly real. Liam, hearing Brenda's angry voice and seeing the looming shape of Vince, began to work with a new, frantic energy. He had finally cleared the main pallet. Now, his task was to clean up the shards of the brick he had broken earlier. He knelt on the frozen ground, his numb fingers fumbling with the sharp, jagged pieces, placing them in a bucket. His new position put him directly at the base of the scaffolding, precisely underneath the spot where Vince was now beginning his clumsy, noisy ascent. In the K9 unit, Thorne watched the entire dynamic unfold. "2 suspects," he murmured, his thumb resting on the radius of his handset. "Female, primary, male, secondary, just exited the trailer." Rook's attention was now locked on the new male figure. He didn't growl at Vince, he just watched, his head low, utterly focused. Vince reached the 5th floor platform, a wide, wind-blasted expanse of unfinished plywood 60 feet in the air. The wind up here was violent, whipping at his jacket and making the loose plastic sheeting on the scaffolding snap and pop like gunfire. He was supposed to look busy. He saw a wooden pallet stacked with cinder blocks and rebar ties, left by the afternoon shift, now frozen to the platform floor. It was in his way. "Stupid," he muttered, his voice stolen by the wind. He wanted to get to the far side, where he could lean against a beam and pretend to work. Instead of walking around it, he decided to move it. He jammed his steel pry bar under the pallet's edge. "Come on, you piece of..." He put his considerable soft weight into the bar. It was a fatal, lazy mistake. The ice holding the pallet didn't break. Instead, the force of the lever, applied incorrectly, simply dislodged the single, outermost brick from the top of the stack. It wasn't a cinder block. It was a standard 8-pound paving brick, but from 60 feet it was a missile. For one horrifying, suspended fraction of a second, the brick teetered on the plywood edge. Vince saw it. He even half reached for it, a clumsy, useless gesture. Then, gravity claimed it. It tipped over the edge and vanished into the darkness below. Vince froze. His mouth fell open. He didn't shout. He didn't warn anyone. He just stared, paralyzed by the sudden, stupid finality of his own action. Down in the darkness, Thorne, who had been tracking the clumsy man on the platform, saw the small, dark object detach. His blood ran cold. His brain, honed by years of tactical training, instantly calculated the physics, the terrifying geometry of the disaster. His eyes snapped down to the small, kneeling figure in the oversized coat. "No," he breathed. But it was Sal, the old carpenter, who reacted first. Sal had been watching it all, Liam on the ground, Vince on the scaffolding. He, more than anyone, understood the layout of the site. He saw the brick fall. He he saw Liam kneeling, oblivious, directly in its path. The fear that had kept him silent for 3 days was violently expelled in a single raw, guttural roar of pure terror. "Liam, no! Kid, get out of there! Move!" The scream ripped through the frozen morning. It startled Brenda, who was just getting back into her SUV. It startled Thorn, who was already reaching for his door handle. And it startled Liam. The boy, who had been focused on the sharp, broken pieces of brick, froze. He looked up, his small face a mask of confusion, blinded by the harsh yellow glare of the floodlights above him. He heard the scream, but he didn't understand it. He saw nothing, but he heard it. A faint, high-pitched, terrifying sound, like a tiny siren, the sound of the air itself being torn apart. It was the whistle of the falling brick, accelerating, growing louder and sharper in the split second before impact, aimed directly at the center of his small, upturned face. Time itself seemed to shatter. The universe, which had been moving with the slow, agonizing grind of the pre-dawn cold, suddenly compressed into a single, terrifying second. Sal's scream, "Move!" was still echoing off the steel beams, a human sound of raw, useless panic. Liam was frozen, his small head tilted back, his gray eyes wide and uncomprehending, staring up into the blinding yellow floodlight that hid the falling missile. He could only hear the whistle, a thin, alien sound that grew from a high-pitched shee to a guttural whoosh in the span of a heartbeat. It was the sound of physics, pure and unforgiving. It was the sound of an 8-pound, ice-covered brick falling 60 feet, accelerating to a terminal velocity that would make it a deadly, skull-crushing projectile. It was 2 seconds from impact. 100 yards away, sitting in the dark cabin of his K9 Explorer, Elias Thorne saw it all. He saw the speck detach. He saw Sal's scream. He saw the boy freeze. His training, his entire being, condensed into a single, devastating calculation. Distance, 300 feet. Time, 2 seconds. It was impossible. He was a spectator to a child's death. "No!" he roared, a sound trapped inside the car, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. "Rook! Go! Go! Go!" he yelled, a desperate, futile command, already lunging for his own door, knowing he was 100 yards and a lifetime too late. But the dog was not in the car. The rear K9 deployment door, the one he had been staring at, was already open, hanging wide in the darkness. Rook was not a missile. He was a shadow. He hadn't waited for the brick. He hadn't even waited for Sal's scream. The moment had come 10 seconds earlier. Thorne, watching the new, clumsy male figure, Vince, ascend the scaffolding, had felt a cold spike of unease. He didn't know what would happen, only that a new, unpredictable element had been added, and the child was at the base of the structure. His hand, acting on pure, instinctive training, had moved to the center console and pressed the small, rubber-covered button, the door popper. The pneumatic hiss and clack of the remote lock releasing was the only sound. Rook hadn't bolted. He had exited the vehicle with the silent, fluid efficiency of a trained weapon, his body low, his claws barely making a sound on the frozen gravel. Thorne had sent him not as an attack, but as a silent cover, to get closer, to observe, to be ready. Rook was already 30 yards from the Explorer, a black and tan blur moving through the shadows, when the brick began to fall. He was already at a full sprint when Sal screamed. The sound was just confirmation. His target, locked in his mind from the moment he left the car, was the small, terrified, hunched-over figure. He smelled the boy's fear, a scent that was a command. Now, the scream and the falling object simply added urgency, shifting his mission from product to intercept. He was not a dog running. He was a 90-pound projectile, uncoiling in a sequence of perfectly efficient, powerful bounds. His muscles burned, his paws gripped the icy mud, and his great lungs pulled in the freezing air, but he felt none of it. His dark, intelligent eyes were fixed on one thing, the small, frail body directly in the path of a danger he couldn't see but knew was coming. Sal was trying to run, his old legs heavy, his lungs searing. "Liam!" he screamed again, stumbling forward. Brenda had just turned, startled by the scream, her face a mask of confusion. Vince, high above, was a paralyzed statue of stupid horror, his hand still on the pry bar. Time snapped back into brutal focus. Liam, hearing the roar of Sal's voice and the escalating whistle from above, finally reacted. He flinched, squeezing his eyes shut and raising his small, gloved hands to cover his head. It was the small, hopeless gesture of a child anticipating a blow. Rook was 3 feet away. He didn't bark. He didn't slow. He didn't swerve. He executed his training, neutralize the threat, protect the victim. In this chaotic, impossible scenario, the victim was the target. With the last of his explosive momentum, Rook launched himself into the air. He didn't nudge the boy. He didn't grab him. He hit him. He slammed into Liam's small 8-year-old body with the full, focused, 90-pound force of a K9 impact. The collision was a sickening, wet thud of body on body. Liam was lifted clean off his feet, thrown backward 5, 6 feet as if he'd been struck by a car. He landed hard on his back in the mud, the air driven from his lungs in a choked gasp. Rook was on top of him an instant later. He didn't check for the brick. He covered the boy's body with his own, a living, breathing, panting shield of fur and muscle. He splayed his paws, braced his legs, and raised his head, teeth bared, snarling at the scaffolding, at the sky, at the unseen enemy that had dared to attack his charge. Crack! The sound was not a thud. It was a detonation. The 8-pound brick, having reached its terminal velocity, obliterated the patch of frozen ground where Liam had been kneeling a half-second before. It didn't just land, it exploded. Shards of frozen mud, jagged splinters of ice, and pulverized brick shrapnel sprayed outward in a deadly radius. A piece of shrapnel, sharp as a razor, zipped past Rook's ear, close enough to make him flinch, but not move. A ringing silence descended, heavier and more profound than the darkness. The whistle was gone. Sal stopped, bent over, his hands on his knees, gasping for air, his mind unable to process what he had just witnessed. Brenda stood by her SUV, one hand clamped over her mouth, her cigarette falling from her other hand. Her eyes were wide, not with concern, but with a primal animal terror. High above, Vince had disappeared, ducking back into the shadows of the platform, a coward vanishing from the consequences of his actions. Elias Thorne was sprinting, his long legs eating up a 100-yard distance, his service weapon drawn and held in a low-ready position. He didn't know what had happened. He had seen the dog engage, seen the boy fly, heard the impact. His first thought was that the man on the scaffold had shot at the boy. He skidded to a halt near the scene, his gray eyes scanning the entire chaotic tableau. Sal gasping, Brenda frozen, the scaffolding empty. And then he looked down. He saw the shattered remains of the brick, a spider web of destruction in the mud. He saw his partner, Rook, standing guard, snarling at the sky. And beneath him, he saw the small, mud-soaked form of Liam. Liam was crying. He wasn't screaming. It was a hitching, gulping, terrified, alive sound. He was shocked, bruised, and covered in mud, the wind knocked out of him by the dog's life-saving tackle, but he was alive. Rook, sensing the immediate threat was over, instantly changed. The snarling protective weapon vanished. He relaxed his posture, turned his great head, and delivered a long, warm, frantic lick across Liam's mud-streaked, tear-stained cheek. The sudden, gentle gesture was so shocking, so unexpected, that Liam's crying hitched into a gasp. He reached out a small, shaking, gloved hand and clutched the thick fur on Rook's neck, holding on as if the dog were the only solid thing in a world that had just tried to kill him. Thorne's knees felt weak with a relief so profound it was almost painful. He holstered his weapon, his hand shaking. He walked forward, his boots crunching on the debris. He finally keyed his shoulder mic, his voice miraculously calm and steady. Unit 14 K9, Code 4, I have the child. He is 10-4. He's safe. Send me a supervisor and send me EMS. We have a confirmed, an attempt, an assault. And get me a unit to the 5th floor of this structure, now. The ringing silence that followed the brick's explosion was a vacuum, sucking all the air and noise from the yard. It lasted only a second, but it felt like an eternity. Then, the world rushed back in. Liam's terrified, gulping sobs. The distant, approaching wail of sirens. Thorne's backup, now running hot. Sal's hacking cough as he tried to catch his breath. And the deep, low, protective growl rumbling from Rook's chest. A sound that was not aimed at Liam, but at everything else in the universe. Elias Thorne moved, his body cutting through the blue-tinged darkness, holstering his weapon as he closed the final 20 feet. His tactical mind was already triaging the scene. One victim, alive, one witness, Sal, one suspect, Brenda, frozen, and one suspect at large, Vince on the scaffold. "Rook, easy." Thorne's voice was low, calm, but laced with an authority that cut through the boy's crying. The dog's ears flicked back, acknowledging his handler, but he did not move from his protective stance over Liam. He was a living shield. Thorne knelt in the mud, his knee sinking into the freezing slurry beside the boy. "Liam," he said softly, using the name Sal had screamed. "My name is Elias. You're safe now. You're safe." Liam didn't seem to hear him. His eyes were squeezed shut, his small, frozen fingers tangled in Rook's thick fur, clutching him with the desperate, absolute grip of a drowning victim. He was shaking violently, a combination of profound shock, bruising cold, and the residual adrenaline from the dog's impact. Rook, sensing the boy was not a threat but a charge, lowered his head and licked the boy's muddy cheek again, a gentle, instinctive act of reassurance. "What in God's name? What did you do?" Brenda's voice, sharp and hysterical, finally sliced through the moment. She had snapped out of her shocked paralysis, and her primary emotion was not relief, but pure, unadulterated, narcissistic panic. The police were here. The 911 call Sal had made, which she must have suspected, was real. "What is going on? Get that animal off of him. You scared him. He's clumsy. He just fell." She took a step forward, her hand raised, as if to pull Liam away herself. "Rook, watch him," Thorne commanded, his voice turning to ice. He didn't even look at Brenda. He pointed one finger at her. Instantly, Rook's head snapped up. He rose slightly off Liam, planted his front paws, and leveled a deep, vibrating snarl directly at Brenda. It was not a warning. It was a promise. Brenda froze, her eyes widening in terror, finally understanding that this was not a pet. Thorne turned his attention to her. He rose slowly to his full height, a tall, angular shadow against the harsh floodlights. He didn't shout. He didn't rush her. He simply tapped the small, square device mounted on his chest, his body-worn camera. The small red light was already blinking, capturing her frantic, selfish words, her hysteria, her complete and utter lack of concern for the child who had just escaped death by inches. "Ma'am," Thorne said, his voice level, "you will stay exactly where you are. You are at an active crime scene." "I saw it. Officer, I saw the whole thing." Sal, his voice raw and shaking, stumbled forward from the shadows, his fear of losing his job finally eclipsed by the horror of what he'd seen. "I saw it. That man, her boyfriend. Vince, he's up there." Sal jabbed a gnarled, accusing finger toward the fifth-floor scaffolding. "He was messing with the pallet. He knocked it off. He did it. And she made him come. She's been making that boy work out here in the cold for days. I seen it. She made him do Vince's job." Brenda's face contorted, her mask of panic shifting into one of pure, venomous rage. You old fool! You're fired! You're dead!" she shrieked at Sal. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Ma'am, you need to be silent, now," Thorne commanded. The shriek of tires on asphalt announced the arrival of his backup. A second Detroit patrol car, lights now flashing, slid to a stop, blocking the main gate. A new officer emerged, a man as different from Thorne as one could be. This was Officer Kowski. He was built like a refrigerator, a 20-year veteran with a broad Slavic face and a thick gray mustache that looked like it could stop a bullet. He moved with a deliberate, plodding weight, his hand resting on his nightstick. "Thorne," he boomed. "What the hell we got here? A ghost?" Thorne was already in motion. "Kowski, fifth-floor scaffolding, male suspect, name's Vince. He just attempted to drop a brick on this child. He is to be considered dangerous. Go." Kowski didn't ask questions. He unclipped his heavy flashlight, nodded once, and moved toward the scaffolding, his voice already barking into his own radio for a third unit to help him secure the multi-level structure. The scene was now descending into controlled chaos. As Kowski secured the perimeter, Thorne turned back to Brenda. Her face had gone chalk white. She saw it all slipping away. Vince, the job, the money. She took one instinctive step backward toward her SUV. "Ma'am, do not move," Thorne said. He began walking toward her. I'm just getting my phone," she stammered, her eyes darting between Thorne, Sal, and the arriving ambulance whose siren was now screaming in the distance. "You are under arrest for child endangerment and accessory to aggravated assault," Thorne said, his voice devoid of all emotion as he unclipped his handcuffs. Brenda's composure finally shattered. "You can't!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "I'm his mother! That's my son! I have rights!" "A mother," Thorne said, stopping directly in front of her, his cold gray eyes boring into hers, would have asked if he was okay. He grabbed her wrist, spun her around with practiced, impersonal efficiency, and forced her hands behind her back. The click, click, click of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was brutally loud in the cold air. "You have the right to remain silent," he began, his voice reciting the Miranda warning as he marched the hysterical, screaming Brenda toward Kowski's arriving backup car. A third car and an ambulance now flooded the yard with red and white flashing lights. Paramedics spilled out, a man and a woman running toward the scene with their bags and a backboard. "What's the victim's status?" The lead paramedic, a young woman with tired eyes and bright pink hair, yelled at Thorne. 8 years old, male, shock, hypothermia, blunt force trauma, Thorne yelled back, handing Brenda off to the backup officer. "The trauma is from my K9, not the brick. The dog saved him." The paramedic nodded, understanding, and knelt beside Liam. And here, the chaos met a new, unexpected wall. Liam was still clutching Rook's fur, his face buried in the dog's neck. "Okay, sweetie, we're going to get you warm," the paramedic said gently, trying to slide her hands under Liam. But Liam, in his state of shock, only clung tighter. The one and only thing that had proven safe in his entire world was this dog. The moment the paramedic touched him, Rook, sensing the boy's spike in terror, let out another low, warning growl, not at the paramedic, but for Liam. "Officer, I need the dog moved," the paramedic said, her voice strained. "I can't assess him if the dog won't let me." Thorne looked at the scene, the small, terrified boy, the immovable, protective K9. He made a decision that was against every protocol. "You can't," he said. "The dog stays. He's the only thing keeping this kid anchored." "I can't transport him with an animal. Then I'm riding with you," Thorne said. "Rook, heel, load up." He gave the command. Rook stood, nudged Liam's hand once, and then with surprising gentleness hopped into the open ambulance. He immediately sat, his eyes fixed on Liam. The boy, seeing his protector move, didn't scream. He just watched, his tiny shaking hand outstretched. "Let's go," Thorne said to the paramedics. "Me, the boy, and the dog. We all go. Now!" The paramedics, Bama, stunned but seeing the logic, quickly bundled the shivering, silent boy onto a gurney and loaded him in, Thorne and Rook right beside him. The ambulance doors slammed shut, a final, definitive sound, sealing Liam inside with his unlikely guardian angel, and sealing Brenda out, her screams fading as the siren began its urgent, piercing cry, pulling away from the frozen, hellish yard. The ambulance was a screaming cocoon of red light and focused, frantic energy, tearing through the awakening streets of Detroit. Inside, the world had compressed to this small, swaying box. Liam, stripped of his wet, muddy coat by the paramedics, was wrapped in a silver and orange thermal blanket. He was small, shockingly so, a pale, bruised bird against the stark white gurney. He hadn't made another sound since his initial sobs. He was locked in a state of profound psychological shock, his gray eyes wide, unblinking, fixed on a single point, the dog. K9 Rook sat on the floor, braced against the vehicle's motion, his body rigid, his attention absolute. He never took his eyes off the boy. Elias Thorne was crammed onto the bench seat, his long legs pressed against the gurney, his presence a silent, calming authority. "Vitals are thready," the lead paramedic, Jenna, announced, her pink hair stark under the white LEDs. She skillfully taped a pediatric IV line to Liam's thin arm. "BP is low. He's hypothermic and in shock. We need to move." Thorne watched her work, his own heart hammering with a residual adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just an officer, he was a guardian. He had made a call that broke a dozen protocols. The K9, his partner, was now in a sterile transport, a massive violation. But as he looked at Liam's small hand, which had crept out from the blanket to lightly touch Rook's ear, he knew it was the only call he could have made. The dog was not just a protector, he was a lifeline. "Rook, stay," Thorne murmured, as much for the paramedics as for the dog. Rook let out a low, assenting whine, his body unmoving. The ambulance shrieked to a halt in the bay of Detroit Receiving Hospital, the doors bursting open before the vehicle had even stopped rocking. The transition was violent, from the dark, cold, siren-filled ambulance into the blinding, white-hot, sterile chaos of the trauma bay. A team was waiting. What do we have, Jenna? The voice belonged to Dr. Aris Sharma, the attending trauma surgeon. He was a man in his mid-40s, lean, with intelligent, exhausted dark eyes, a salt and pepper stubble shadowing his angular jaw, and an air of absolute weary command. He wore faded blue scrubs and a stethoscope draped around his neck like a familiar burden. 8-year-old male, found at a construction site, suspected child abuse, severe hypothermia, shock. Jenna rattled off the report as they transferred Liam to a hospital bed. Patient is nonverbal. Oh, and we have a complication. Dr. Sharma's eyes, which had been scanning Liam's vitals on the monitor, snapped up. He saw Thorn, in his dark mud-stained uniform. And then he saw the dog, a 90-pound German shepherd, standing in the middle of his sterile ER. Absolutely not, Sharma said, his voice flat, final. Get that animal out of my trauma bay, now. Doctor, Thorn started, stepping forward. I don't care what he is, Sharma cut him off, his focus entirely on the child. This is a sterile field, not a kennel. Get it out. A nurse, a large strong man, moved to block Rook's path. It was the wrong move. Liam, who had been a silent, pale ghost, suddenly convulsed. As he saw the nurse step between him and the dog, a sound ripped from his small chest. It was not a cry. It was a raw, primal, animalistic shriek of pure terror. He thrashed on the gurney, his small body arching, his hand lunging for the dog. No! 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 His vitals monitor, silent until now, erupted in a cacophony of alarms as his heart rate skyrocketed. He's crashed! Jenna yelled. Dr. Sharma stared, shocked by the violence of the boy's reaction. Thorn seized the moment. Doctor! His voice cut through the alarms. That dog is the only reason he is alive. He is a police K9. He is my partner. He stays or you lose the kid to shock. Your call. Sharma, a pragmatist above all, looked at the screaming child, then at the alarms, then at the unmoving, disciplined dog. He made a decision in a fraction of a second. Fine, he snapped at Thorn. But you and that dog stand in that corner. You do not move, you do not speak, you do not touch anything. Now, somebody get me a warming blanket and 5 milligrams of Versed, stat. The chaos subsided into focused action. Thorn and Rook moved to the designated corner, 2 dark, silent statues in the white room. Rook sat, his body alert, watching as the medical team swarmed Liam, cutting away the last of his clothes, applying warm saline IVs, checking his bruised ribs, and wrapping him in a high-tech bear hugger warming blanket. Liam, seeing Rook was still there, had quieted, his terror receding back into a shivering, non-verbal shock. Thorn stood rigid, his phone vibrating in his pocket. It was his supervisor, then CPS. He ignored them. His entire world was focused on the small boy on the table. He saw the bruises now, dark purple and yellow marks on the boy's pale torso, some old, some new. He saw the raw, red chafe marks on his wrists. This was not one bad day. This was a lifetime of torment. Thorn felt the old, familiar ice in his own veins, the memory of his first night in a foster care group home, the smell of disinfectant, the cold sheets, the terrifying loneliness. He saw himself in the boy, and his resolve hardened into granite. An hour later, Liam was stable. He had been moved to a quiet, warm room in the pediatric wing. The blinding lights of the ER were replaced by the soft, dim glow of a single lamp. He was clean, dressed in a small hospital gown, and tucked into a bed with cartoon dinosaurs on the sheets. He was awake, but he wasn't there. He just stared at the beige wall, his gray eyes empty. In the corner of the room, on a blanket a nurse had reluctantly provided, lay Rook, his head on his paws, watching. Thorn stood by the window, the city lights blurring in the darkness. He had finished the preliminary report with his supervisor and spoken to a CPS agent. The wheels were in motion. Brenda and Vince were in custody. Sal's testimony, combined with Thorn's body cam footage, was damning. The door opened softly. A woman stood there, flanked by a tired-looking social worker. The woman was in her late 30s, with the same soft brown hair as Liam, pulled back in a messy but practical bun. She wore green nurse's scrubs, wrinkled, as if she had just come off a long shift. Her face was kind, with high cheekbones and hazel eyes that were now wide with a terrible, dawning dread. This was Margaret. Maggie? Is he? She whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Aunt Maggie? the social worker said gently. "This is Officer Thorne. He found Liam." Maggie's eyes flew from the social worker to Thorne, and then to the small, silent figure in the bed. "Oh, God," she breathed. It was not a curse. It was a prayer. "Oh, Liam, my baby." She rushed to the bedside, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch. "What did they do to you? What did she do?" She looked at Thorne, her eyes blazing with a grief and fury so profound it was terrifying. "I tried," she said, her voice cracking, tears streaming down her face. "I tried to get him. After my sister, his mom, passed. And then Robert. I fought her. I took her to court." Thorne nodded, stepping forward. "Brenda," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "She's his legal stepmother. The judge sided with her." Maggie choked on a sob. "He said a child needed to be with his mother. He didn't see. He didn't know what she was. She wanted his father's survivor benefits. That's all he was to her. A paycheck." She finally sat on the edge of the bed, gently taking Liam's small, limp hand. "Liam, honey, it's Aunt Maggie. You're safe now. I'm here. I'm not going to let her hurt you ever again." But Liam didn't respond. He didn't turn. He didn't blink. He just stared at the wall. Maggie's face crumpled, her hope dissolving. He won't look at me. He doesn't even know I'm here." Thorne watched for a long, quiet moment. He looked at the heartbroken woman, the traumatized boy, and his partner, the silent guardian in the corner. He made another call. "Rook," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Go see." The dog stood in one fluid motion. He padded silently across the linoleum floor. He didn't jump on the bed. He didn't push. He simply stopped at Maggie's side and rested his great, intelligent head on the mattress, right beside Liam's free hand, his warm breath fogging the cold sheets. Maggie gasped, startled. Liam's gaze remained fixed on the wall, but then a change, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker in his fingers. Slowly, as if moving a great weight, his small hand moved. His fingers twitched, then uncurled. They crept across the sheet, 2 inches, 3, until they found the dog's thick, warm fur. They dug in, clutching, just as they had in the ambulance. Rook let out a low, deep sigh, a sound of pure contentment, and nudged his head gently into the boy's hand. Liam's empty gaze finally broke from the wall. His head turned slowly. He looked at the dog's dark, kind eyes. He looked at his hand, buried in the fur. Then his eyes traveled up, past the dog, to the kind, weeping face of his aunt. And finally, his gaze found the tall, uniformed officer standing by the window. He looked at them all, his small face a mask of confusion. His lips parted. A small, raspy sound, his first in hours, escaped. "Sss, Rook?" It was a question. It was a statement. It was the first word of his new life. Maggie let out a sob of pure, unadulterated relief, her hands covering her face. Thorne felt the ice in his own chest finally, definitively, crack. The word hung in the sterile, quiet room, as fragile as a spider's silk. "Rook?" It was the first sound Liam had made that wasn't a scream, and it acted like a key, unlocking the frozen scene. Margaret's breath, which she hadn't realized she was holding, exploded from her in a raw, ragged sob of pure, unadulterated relief. It wasn't just a sound. It was the sound of 1,000 pounds of terror and grief, finally crashing to the floor. She lunged forward, wrapping her arms around her nephew, her tears soaking his thin hospital gown, whispering, "Yes, baby, yes, it's Rook, and I'm here. It's Aunt Maggie. Oh my God, Liam, I'm here." Liam didn't hug her back. His small, thin arms remained rigid, and his gaze was still locked on the dog, but he didn't pull away. He had anchored himself to the one solid thing in the room, and that anchor was allowing him, just barely, to tolerate the human touch. Elias Thorne watched from the window, his professional mask crumbling. He felt a profound, painful tightening in his own chest, an echo of a loneliness he thought he had buried decades ago. He saw the social worker in the doorway, her pen frozen over her clipboard, her own eyes wet. Rook, the catalyst for it all, merely let out a long, low sigh, his tail giving a single, heavy thump-thump on the linoleum. Thorne stayed for another hour, a silent, uniformed guardian in the corner, while Maggie sat on the bed, her voice low and soft, telling Liam about her apartment in Ann Arbor, about the small park across the street, about the cat she had, named Fish. Liam said nothing more, but his eyes, for the first time, began to move. They flickered from Rook to his aunt, and, most nervously, to Thorn. When the time came for Thorn to leave, a palpable tension returned. "I have to go, Liam," Thorn said, his voice gentle. "I have work, but I'll be back. And Rook will come too." At the sound of his name and the shift in his handler's tone, Rook stood. Liam's hand, which had been resting on the dog's head, instantly tightened, his knuckles white. A small, panicked sound, a tiny "n" sound, started in his throat. Rook looked at Liam, then back at Thorn, a clear canine conflict in his eyes. He did not want to leave this boy. "Rook, heel," Thorn commanded softly, but with finality. With a visible reluctance, the big shepherd pulled away from the bed and took his place at Thorn's left leg. Liam watched him go, his small face crumpling. Thorn felt like a monster, but the investigation was now his, and it was demanding his full attention. The precinct was buzzing. The case of the construction site kid was already blowing up. Thorn walked through the chaos, mud still drying on his uniform pants, and headed straight for the office of his supervisor, Sergeant Miller. Miller was a bear of a man, with a permanently skeptical expression and a face that looked like it had been carved from hardwood, framed by a thick, gray-flecked beard. He was tough, old school, and had zero tolerance for procedural mistakes. "Thorn," Miller grunted, not looking up from a stack of files. "You, your dog, and an ambulance. You want to tell me what the hell that was?" Thorn stood at attention. "The K9 was a non-traditional de-escalation tool, Sergeant. The victim was non-responsive and going into cardiac distress upon separation. The dog was the only thing anchoring him. It was a medical necessity." Miller finally looked up, his sharp blue eyes assessing Thorn. He stared for a long moment, then let out a sigh. "I saw your body cam footage, and the tape from the paramedic. Christ." He shook his head. "And this..." He tapped another file. "This is the sworn statement from the witness, Salvatrelli. Says he saw the whole thing, saw the female, Brenda, force the kid to work, saw the male, Vince, on the platform, saw him drop the brick. It's ironclad. Vince is singing like a canary, blaming Brenda. Brenda's screaming for a lawyer, claiming parental rights. It's a disgusting mess." He leaned back, his chair creaking. "You did good, Thorn. You broke protocol, you put your animal in a civilian transport, and you probably saved that kid's life twice in one morning. Now get out of here, go home, and wash the mud off your dog." The next few weeks were a blur of legal and therapeutic progress. Liam was released from the hospital into the emergency custody of his Aunt Maggie. They lived in her small third-floor apartment in Ann Arbor, a city an hour away from the grime of Detroit, filled with trees and parks. It was safe. It was warm. But Liam was not better. The boy who had spoken in the hospital was gone again, replaced by a silent, watchful ghost. He was diagnosed with severe PTSD. The trauma of his parents' deaths, compounded by months of Brenda's cold, calculated abuse and the final, terrifying moments at the construction site, had walled him off. He wouldn't speak. He wouldn't make eye contact. And he was terrified of noise. A car door slamming in the street would make him jump. A plate dropped in the kitchen would send him scrambling under the table. When a city maintenance crew started using a jackhammer on the street below, Maggie found him huddled in his closet, hands clamped over his ears, his body rigid with a terror so profound he was almost catatonic. Maggie enrolled him in therapy with Dr. Evelyn Reed, a woman in her late 50s, with a soft, melodic voice, and the kind of profound, patient calm that only comes from decades of working with traumatized children. She had kind, crinkling eyes behind simple wireframe glasses, and she never wore a white coat, preferring soft cardigans and gentle colors. Her office was filled with sunlight, art supplies, and beanbag chairs. But for 2 sessions, Liam did nothing. He sat on the smallest beanbag in the farthest corner and stared at the floor. Dr. Reed spoke, she drew, she offered him toys. He remained a stone. On the 3rd session, Maggie, desperate, called Thorn. He's not letting anyone in," she whispered into the phone. Can you please bring him?" The next day, Thorn, in a civilian polo shirt and jeans, knocked on Dr. Reed's office door. Beside him, Rook stood, his tail giving a polite, inquisitive wag. When Liam, huddled in his corner, saw the dog, his entire body changed. His head snapped up. his eyes, dull and empty a second before, suddenly lit with a sharp, focused spark. "Rook?" he whispered. It was the first word he had spoken in a week. Dr. Reed's eyes widened. Thorne nodded. "Go see, buddy." Rook trotted over, his nails click-clacking softly on the hardwood floor, and nudged Liam's hand. Liam immediately buried both hands in the dog's fur, his shoulders relaxing for the first time. Dr. Reed looked at Thorne, a look of profound understanding on her face. "Well," she said softly, "it seems we have a new co-therapist." From then on, Rook was a mandatory part of every session. With the dog at his feet, Liam began to emerge. He would speak, but only to the dog. He would tell Rook about the bad dreams. He would tell him about the loud noises. And the dog would listen, his head tilted, his warm presence an absolute non-judgmental comfort. About a week later, during one of these sessions, there was a knock. Maggie opened it to find Sal, the old carpenter, standing in the hallway, twisting his worn flat cap in his gnarled hands. He looked terrified, his eyes red-rimmed. "Ma'am, Miss Margaret," he stammered, I just came to see the boy, to say I'm sorry. I should have called sooner. I was a coward." "Mr. Salvatorelli," Maggie said, her voice soft. "You're the man who saved his life. Please, come in." Sal stepped in, his heavy work boots looking enormous and out of place on the colorful rug. He saw Liam, saw the officer, and saw the dog, and he nodded, as if this all made sense. I ain't got much," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But when I went back to get my tools, I found this, near where the brick hit. It was his. I seen him with it." He held out a small, spiral-bound sketchbook. It was warped and stained, the edges stiff with dried mud. Liam, who had tensed when the stranger entered, stared at the book. He slowly reached out and took it. He opened the cover. Inside, the pages were filled with the crayon and pencil drawings of an 8-year-old. The first few pages were just buildings. Tall, dark, angry-looking skyscrapers with no windows, drawn with hard, black lines. They were oppressive, menacing. He was always drawing," Sal whispered. "Drawing them buildings he had to work at." Maggie and Thorne watched as Liam turned the pages. Then the drawings changed. A small stick figure appeared at the bottom of the buildings. A few pages later, a new shape appeared. It was large, black, and tan, with 4 legs and pointy ears. A dog. It was roughly drawn, but unmistakable. As Liam turned the pages, the dog got bigger, the drawings more detailed. In one, the stick figure boy was standing next to the giant dog. In another, the dog was standing over the boy, who was sleeping. Thorne knelt, his eyes locked on the drawings. Then, Liam turned to the last page, the one he must have drawn just before he lost the book. The drawing was simple. It was the small, stick figure boy, but he was standing inside the outline of a massive German shepherd, as if the dog were a suit of armor. And above it, in the shaky, blocky letters of a child, was one word: Rook. Thorne stared at the drawing, his throat closing. He looked at the dog, then at the boy. This wasn't just a rescue. It wasn't a coincidence. This dog, this protector. Liam had been drawing his savior, calling for him, long before he ever knew his name. The silence in Dr. Reed's sunlit office was absolute, heavier and more profound than the silence at the construction site. It was a silence held by 5 people, all staring at a single, mud-stained, crayon-drawn image. A stick figure boy standing inside the protective armor of a giant German shepherd, with the name Rook scrawled above it. Sal, the old carpenter, stood by the door, his cap held over his heart, his breath catching in his chest. Maggie knelt, her hand covering her mouth, her tears blurring the image. Dr. Reed, the professional, looked on with a profound, analytical awe, and Elias Thorne, the cop, felt a cold, prickling sensation crawl up his spine, a feeling that defied his logical, evidence-based world. Liam was the only one who seemed calm. He just looked at his drawing, then at the real breathing dog at his feet, as if confirming a fact he had always known. It was Dr. Reed who finally broke the stillness, her voice soft, measured, trying to place this miracle into a clinical framework. "Liam," she said gently, "that word, rook, do you remember where you saw it?" Liam looked at her, his first real, direct eye contact. He didn't speak. He just turned his small hand and pointed, not at the dog. He pointed directly at Elias Thorne. Thorne was confused. Me? Liam nodded. He pointed specifically at Thorne's hip, where his radio and K9 remote would normally be. Thorne's mind raced back to the rescue, the chaos, the ambulance. My car? He ventured. Liam nodded again, more vigorously. Thorne looked at Maggie, understanding dawning. It's on the side of my Explorer, the K9 unit designation. K9 Rook. He must have seen it. Dr. Reed exhaled slowly, a look of beautiful academic clarity on her face. Of course, Liam, your mind, even in that state of terror, it absorbed him. It saw its protector and absorbed his name. You weren't drawing a fantasy, Liam. She knelt, her eyes level with his. You were drawing a memory. You were calling for the helper you knew had come. You were telling us, in the only way you knew how, who you trusted. Sal, seeing this, felt a final, peaceful click in his soul. He had delivered the message. He had closed the circle. He quietly placed his cap on his head, gave a single respectful nod to Thorne and Maggie, and slipped out of the office, his conscience finally, blessedly, clean. That afternoon, the dam of Liam's silence broke. It wasn't a flood. It was a trickle. It started with words spoken only to Rook. "Good dog," he whispered, his face buried in the dog's fur. You were fast." And as the days turned into weeks, the trickle became a stream. With Rook as his bridge, he began to speak to Maggie, then to Dr. Reed, and finally, haltingly, to Thorne. He was still a traumatized boy. He still flinched at loud, sudden noises. He still had nightmares that left his dinosaur sheets soaked in sweat, but he was no longer a ghost. The walls were coming down. The weeks bled into a cold, wet spring. The trial of Brenda and Vince was swift and brutal. The evidence, as Sergeant Miller had noted, was ironclad. Sal's tearful, unflinching testimony as an eyewitness. Thorne's body cam footage, which showed Brenda's hysterical, selfish panic and complete lack of concern for Liam. The forensic analysis of the brick, which showed no ice or binding frost, proving Vince's claim that it was stuck and slipped was a lie. It had been actively, carelessly pried loose. And finally, Brenda's bank records, which showed a clear pattern of draining Liam's survivor benefit accounts for cash withdrawals that matched Vince's bar tabs. Thorne took the stand, his voice cold and precise as he recounted the events. But the most powerful testimony came from a source that never entered the courtroom: the mud-stained sketchbook. It was entered as evidence of prior neglect, proof that this child lived in a world of such menace that he was manifesting an imaginary protector long before the rescue. The drawing of the boy inside the dog brought a cold, furious silence to the courtroom. Brenda was found guilty on all counts: felony child endangerment, criminal negligence, and welfare fraud. Vince was found guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, the brick, and felony endangerment. Their sentencing was severe. They would be gone, locked away, for a very long time. Thorne drove to Ann Arbor to deliver the news himself. It was a Saturday in late May. The brutal Detroit winter had finally, reluctantly, given way to a glorious, defiant Michigan spring. The trees were exploding in a riot of impossible green. He pulled his civilian truck, not the K9 Explorer, up to a small, neat rental house with a bright blue door. Maggie had moved them from the apartment, using the last of her savings to give Liam a small patch of grass, a place where he wouldn't hear neighbors' doors slamming. Thorne, in jeans and a simple gray t-shirt, walked up the path. Rook, off-duty and wearing a simple leather collar, trotted ahead, his tail wagging. He didn't bother knocking. The door was open. He walked around to the backyard, and the scene that met him stopped him cold. The yard was small, but it was theirs. And in the center of it, on the grass, was Liam. He was taller, his cheeks filled out, his pale, bruised skin now warmed by the sun. He was wearing shorts, a Superman t-shirt, and a pair of dirty sneakers. And he was holding a hammer. He was deliberately, carefully, tapping a small nail into a plank of wood. Tap, tap, tap. The sound, which Dr. Reed confirmed had once been his primary trigger, was now his. He was controlling it. He wasn't scared. He was building. Beside him, Maggie was painting, her face smeared with red paint, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on her face. They were building a doghouse. It was a magnificent, slightly crooked structure, but it was being built with an intensity of love that made it stronger than any skyscraper. Needs to be higher on this side, Liam said, his voice clear and bright. His head is too big. Maggie laughed. I think his head is perfect. Maybe your measuring is off, Mr. Foreman. I'm not the foreman, Liam said seriously, squinting at the nail. I'm the architect. At that moment, Rook let out a happy, impatient bark from the pathway. Liam's head snapped up. His face, which had been serious with concentration, exploded into a smile so bright it almost hurt to look at. Rook! Elias! He dropped the hammer, a sound that didn't even make him flinch, and sprinted across the grass. He didn't just hug the dog. He launched himself at Thorn, wrapping his arms around the officer's waist in a tackle that almost knocked the strong man off his feet. Thorn, stunned, his arms instinctively coming around the boy, felt a sudden, sharp, unfamiliar stinging behind his eyes. He looked over Liam's head at Maggie, who was watching them, her hand over her heart, her smile the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Hey, buddy, Thorn managed, his voice thick. Looks like you're busy. We are, Liam said, pulling back, his face alight. It's the new foundation. Dr. Reed said you can't build a strong house on a bad foundation, so we're making a new one. He grabbed Thorn's hand and pulled him toward the doghouse. Look, see? It's strong. Rook was already investigating, sniffing every corner of the new structure, his tail thumping against the plywood. Liam picked up a paintbrush. On the perfectly painted red side, Maggie had stenciled the dog's name, but Liam wasn't finished. He dipped the brush in a can of black paint. Underneath the name, he began to carefully paint a picture. It wasn't a stick figure. It was a rough but loving child's painting of a boy with brown hair, standing next to a tall, uniformed police officer. They were a team. There, Liam said, stepping back, covered in paint and pride. Now it's finished. A house for the hero and his partner. Thorn knelt, his eyes level with Liam's. He looked at the painting, at the boy, at the dog happily settling into his new home. He thought of the ice, the blood, the fear, the cold, gray emptiness in his own past. And he knew, with an absolute certainty that defied all logic, that the boy hadn't just been saved. They all had. Rook had saved Liam's life, but Liam, with his drawings, his courage, and his crooked, perfect house, had saved him. He had given the solitary officer a new foundation, a new purpose, a family. It's perfect, Liam, Thorn said, his voice catching. It's the strongest house I've ever seen. Liam's story reminds us that even in the coldest winters of our lives, God is working. Miracles are not always loud. Sometimes, a miracle is the courage of a stranger like Sal to make a call. Sometimes, it's an officer like Thorn, turning his past pain into a shield for others. And sometimes, God's angels don't have wings. They have paws and a K9 vest. Rook was the answer to a prayer Liam didn't know how to speak. He was the guardian sent to stand between a child and destruction. As Psalm 91 says, He will command His angels concerning you, to guard you in all your ways. In our daily lives, we can be that miracle. Be the Sal who speaks up. Be the Maggie who offers a safe home. Be the reason someone believes in goodness again. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Comment Amen if you believe in guardian angels, both human and animal. And please subscribe for more true stories of faith and incredible courage. God bless you and everyone you love. May He always place a protector on your path.